Don't be shy. All right. Well, I want to get, we're a little bit running a little behind, but I want to get to the next steps that we have to take to get to where we have to get to. But first, I'm just too intrigued about how some of the steps were taken so far and how you got there. So just briefly, Enric, what's the secret? How does Pristine Seas convince a country's leader that it's in his or her political interests to take conservation in mind?
In my previous life, I was a professor at the University of California, and I was studying the impacts of humans in the ocean. And one day, I realized that all I was doing was rewriting the obituary of the ocean with more data, more precision, more statistical significance, and we had more papers, right? Wow. But we didn't get anything protected. And when I left academia and came here to National Geographic and started working with economists and social scientists, I realized that the rational arguments are not the most important, right? And we have developed a method that just happened. It's just trial and error at Pristine Seas, where first we make the leaders fall in love with those places. If we can take them with us into the field, we got them. Right? We've taken a president to the field, and he said, wow, we need to do this. If not, then we use media. We use videos. Sometimes we produce videos that are seen by just one or two people. You know, our audience is one person, the decision maker, right? And the influencers around that person. So we first want to make that person fall in love with the place and understand the urgency of the threat and feel the need for him or her to become the hero who's going to save that place. And then we come with the science to satisfy the bureaucrats in the agencies, right? But this is an approach where first we touch the heart, and then we make sure that all these questions, what about the fishing? What about the people? That we have an answer, economic as well as scientific for the question.
If it works for country leaders, we hope that that same approach can work for the public at large eventually too, to go forward. Now, Dominique, in the colonial era, people like you were not even allowed into Gorongosa Park. And now you're one of the leaders in keeping the park restored and keeping it moving forward. How did that change come about?
Well, I have to say it's a massive change. That's why in Gorongosa we're still working with communities to show them that it's open, it's yours now. Come to us. What we do, we not just use social media, but also we, as Enric said, we bring the people. We give them memories. We make them try and see by themselves. Every day in Gorongosa, we receive people from the buffer zone, kids, all age people that come and share and see what we're doing and see their relatives and enjoy everything. We also have, at the Wilson Lab, we have a trainee program for people, for young people from the buffer zone that just finished high school. And they come to Gorongosa, they spend some time with us, a year or so, and they just get connection with all other scientists and people in the park. And they also develop this new idea. And they go home, of course, and they tell their parents that it's different. It's not what you used to tell me. And they might not even believe that that was once a past. So we did that too.
Again, it's bringing people intimately into the context of the park that helps. Andrea, just as an aside, I noticed in one of the slides you had an elephant in a truck. I was curious, how do you move 500 elephants?
It's a very good question with a lot of planning and a lot of beer for the capture crew at night. It was an incredible event that took a good year of planning, and the logistics involved, I'd have to say, is nothing short than a feat. In terms of the grading of roads, the building of machinery to actually lift elephants, anesthetized elephants. And so very quickly, I mean, what we do is we knew we needed to move around 500 elephants to reduce conflict in 2 parks, conflict with people, and also to reduce the pressures that actually a growing elephant population had been having on natural resources. And we wanted to move them to a 3rd park under our management that had once 1,200 elephants. Fewer than 100 remained because of poaching, but again, the same thing, securing the park, stopping the poaching, making it safe to move them in. But it involved helicopters, finding family units to dart and physically lift and move into trucks, specially made trucks for this. Given antidotes, they're waking up, they are driven into a new park. As long as family units are kept together, we found that it really is an exercise in stress management, but as long as they're kept together, they do well. And ended up being 520 elephants were rehomed, and we know that some of the females have already given birth, and they're thriving in their new home.
And in addition to the protection that the parks are providing to the wildlife, some of your parks are providing protection to humans as well. We're included in the lives that need protecting. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So of the 12 parks that we currently manage, 2 of which actually have more than 50,000 people legally living in those parks. And they're allowed to be there, and they're custodians of the park. And so we work very closely with them in terms of the day-to-day management. And one thing, whenever we bring a park under our management, we create a separate legal entity for that park. That legal entity has a board, and across the 12 parks, there is 100% representation by local communities who sit on that board, along with our government partners, along with ourselves, making those decisions. In terms of the security side of this, it is interesting to see parks that we manage in places like Central African Republic, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I mean, there's a civil war happening in CAR right now. Sadly, we have more than 300 refugees that, fleeing for their lives, came to Chinko, that's the name of the park there, came there because they knew it was a source of safety and security and that they would be protected. They're currently living inside the park that we are feeding and caring for. And the same in the DRC, where we're dealing with South Sudanese rebels with the Lord's Resistance Army who are poaching elephants, and they are kidnapping local people. We're often not just the first responder, but the only responder in those regions of providing for safety and security for people.
It's so much about the people. And Tom, you show how a sheep ranch can go from being a degraded environment to a beautiful grassland in a matter of years. But what happens to the sheep ranchers? What happens to the people who are making a living on that ranch? What's your strategy there?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily the job of conservationists to prop up dying resource industries. But it is the job of conservationists to make sure that protected areas help benefit local communities. It doesn't mean that every job in a degrading industry must be retained somewhere else. And in fact, when the former Estancia Valle Jacabuco was purchased, every one of the gauchos that had been employed was offered a new job, to stay on with the park project. Many did decide to stay. Some went off to other ranches, and I'm sure continuing to work in the livestock industry. But as an employer now, the Patagonia Park Project is a much larger generator of local economic vitality as a consequence of wilderness conservation than it ever was as a sheep ranch, where tens of thousands of sheep were hammering a landscape to which they were not adopted and never should have been introduced. So, a great example of one of the people who stayed was the former Leonero, the man whose job was to go out and track and kill mountain lions, is now the head tracker for the biologists to go out and track and tag and monitor and conserve and protect mountain lions. So his life and his work, he is using his skills, where once we're targeted at killing a top predator of the ecosystem, to now conserving that same species.
Great. There's, well, since we are running a little late, I had some other questions for you, Alison, too, but let's jump ahead. Let's, as a group now, look at the next steps. And I'd like to try a little different thought experiment when you're doing this. I mentioned Ebenezer Scrooge in the beginning, looking at the future and seeing devastation. Let's do the reverse. Let's say it's 2067 and half the Earth is protected. Thank you, Ed, for the work that you've done there. And let's say that our ecological footprint as a species has shrunk enormously. And let's say that the extinction rate has fallen by 80%, okay? So, great, thank you very much. You did a great job, but what are the steps that you took? How do we get there? How did you get there? And we could start with the people problem. What do we do with the people? I'm just throwing this out. Or Alison, let's say it's 2047. Even earlier, we have the realization of a dream that's been going on for a long time, of a wildlife corridor from Yellowstone to the Yukon. How did that become achieved?
Well, thank you for moving back the target date. Yeah. I was going to say, by 2067, I hope we have achieved our land acquisition goals, and I hope we've achieved them by 2037, well before that. I think in that future, we've learned from each other. What I didn't say about our wildlife-friendly ranching program, Wild Sky, is that model was actually one that our board members learned about in Africa on a visit to parks in southern Africa, a cheetah conservancy that had tried a livestock model like that, where they're working with local ranchers. So I think the formula is finding the right model for your biome and your geography, figuring out how to bring the species back, figuring out how the public benefits. We heard that in all these presentations today, and then finding a way to support your park in perpetuity. And for us, that will mean building an endowment large enough to support its operations going forward.
Okay, if I mention Ebenezer Scrooge one more time after this, just haul me off the stage, okay? But one thing that happened in that story, too, is when he got converted and saw the light, not only did Tiny Tim get saved and everything turn out happy for the people around him, but Ebenezer became giddily happy himself in assuming this new approach, this new way of thinking about his life. He became himself reborn, in a sense. So, I mean, I'd like to put that into a species frame, too. How do we get people to understand that changing our frame of reference to protecting species as something we do for ourselves? How do we go about doing that? Anybody?
So if we look at this example of Majetti in Malawi that I gave, it took 3 years for us to be able to have the management rights to manage that park. Governments didn't want to hand over. It was a loss of power. Even failing states and failed parks, why hand over something that, there were a lot of questions around it. I think what's interesting now is we were provided the space and time to show what can actually happen with good management. In a short period of time, you saw those results. And then what happened was the Malawian government was so happy with that, they extended our mandate and allowed us to bring on 2 more parks in Malawi. So we currently manage 3 parks in Malawi and are responsible for 90% of the country's elephant herd. We're also seeing this in places like Chad, where you do well for a few years with 1 park and people start to can be converted. They start to see, and I don't think, unfortunately, I don't think it is so altruistic. It's not, it's really about good management and seeing real impacts, seeing impacts for local communities and local people who often have the right to vote. There is the economic side of this, and actually seeing, with the 500 elephant translocation, we were able to position Malawi as an emerging leader for elephant conservation across the globe. That was a really important positioning for them that I don't think they could even have bought that kind of recognition or seat at the table. So I think it's interesting seeing this groundswell, and as Enric said, you're often dealing with one person who is able to make that decision. And so I think, obviously, identifying who those people are, for us, it often is heads of state. And again, I could keep going with examples of our recent park we signed on in Benin. We were brought into the country by a new president, President Talon, who saw what was happening in Rwanda and saw what it meant to have well-functioning protected areas. And it's part of their national strategy. It's called Revealing Benin. And a big piece of that is the overhauling and the turning around of protected area management. So we're seeing a groundswell, and it's an exciting time.
Can I jump on that
Sure.
as well?
Yeah.
Because I couldn't agree more that political leadership matters. And politicians come to an ecological epiphany when there is successful communication and outreach to them, and when they see a potential benefit to a constituency they care about. The fact that we see President Macri in Argentina in his administration dramatically committing to expand the national park system has already helped do that. We see the National Parks Administration just creating a new structure for marine national parks, for no-take marine national parks. And we see in the last newest national park that Macri established, the Macri government, in the press, this was quite extraordinary, and this is why I want to mention the anecdote. He explicitly, in the press release about the designation of Akanwija National Park, referenced habitat protection and the expansion of the national park system as directly related to the national commitment to meet Argentina's climate targets. So here you have someone at the highest level of political power and influence understanding that just transitioning to a low carbon economy doesn't solve the climate challenge. We have to protect huge expanses of habitat which will naturally sequester carbon. You have to solve the wilderness destruction problem to solve the climate problem. So that kind of political leadership, I know there's a president around here in this town who likes to go golfing on the weekend. In Argentina, he comes up and does wildlife watching, and the president does. I would like to see maybe some outreach in the current administration here, maybe education.
So it's 2067, and how we did it? Well, we convinced people, right? But we are only going to create so many parks just because people think it's a good idea or it makes sense from an ecological perspective or because nature provides ecosystem services for us, right? At the end of the day, what works is people's self-interest, right? For a leader, it can be her legacy. Right. If you talk to a leader in the last 6 months of her administration, it's so much easier, right, than if you talk to her at the beginning of her term, right? And for normal people who live near a park, it's their livelihood, it's their day-to-day living, right? So at the end, we can have all the scientific information, and we can have the explanation of why having all this diversity benefits us, right? But it's going to be an economic argument, and we need to. Global benefits of conservation are needed to justify the scale, but then if we want implementation, if we want creation of protected areas, we have to localize the benefits at the country level, right? If it's a president who's making the decision, or at the regional level, or at the local level, right? We are not going to convince a local village in Brazil to create a fully protected area based on the global benefits for carbon sequestration, right? The benefits have to be local. So this is a factor, a layer, the economic layer that we have to add since the very beginning as we develop the scientific justification and analysis of what half of the Earth should be protected, and at the same time, how we manage our activities in the other half, right? Because we don't want all the effort, all the exploitation to be relocated in 50%, because otherwise it's going to be a disaster.
Right. Dominique, did you have something to
I
add?
just wanted to say, of course it depends on the context, but I agree with all of you that it really starts with the political level and also people and the place. What we do in Gorongosa, we don't really bring very, very new things. What we do is say to the government, we know you have this program, but for example, we know you have difficulties to reach that community that is surrounding us. Let us help you. We'll help you with logistics and everything. Our health program, for example, is not that we designed a health program. That is already created by the government. What we do, we support them to bring the health program for the community. And the community also see that big change is brought by the park, but also the government. So they are more willing to accept us. These are the programs that make them have a deeper connection, more contact with nature. Just remind them about what we are. Mm-hmm. And, just forget about all the bad. This is a new thing. This is a new model. We're all doing this together. And also, all these benefits, it really has to start with the community. That's why I always focus a lot on girls' education, because at least in my country, most of the pressures on the ecosystem comes because less people at school, girls getting married very, very early. And if we break that, we just, coming with some, it's not going to happen tomorrow or next year, but in the next years, it will be something very, very huge and transformative.
It's so important. I think, Ed, you pointed out in the book, too, that if you, wherever the female population is educated and brought up, also the population rate goes down. The reproductive rate goes down to a sustainable level, and that's just one of the arrows in the quiver of the solution to this problem. I'd like to bring it out to you guys now. Questions from the audience for our panel? Anybody?
Question for Enric about
Could you just wait for the mic here?
Yes. Greatest threats.
So I wondered if Enric would care to comment on the fact that the greatest threat to marine biodiversity and biodiversity in general right now resides a few blocks from here, and what is the strategy going forward? What is the prognosis for the marine protected areas designated by the Bush and Obama administrations?
Yeah. Okay. So the three main threats to ocean biodiversity. One is too much fishing. We're taking fish out of the ocean faster than they can reproduce. And the US is an exception of science-based fisheries management that is recovering some stocks, but most of the world is going on the opposite direction. And if we continue like this, by 2050, all the major fisheries of the world will have collapsed. Two, pollution, especially plastic pollution. 8 million tons of plastic enter the ocean every year, and 80% of that comes from the land, and 90% of the plastic in the ocean comes from only 10 rivers. The Niger, the Nile, and then a bunch of Asian rivers, because of waste mismanagement. And this plastic not only ends up killing hundreds of thousands of seabirds, marine mammals, all around, and sea turtles all around the world, but actually a third of the fish in England has ingested plastic. And now nanoplastics have been shown to cross the blood-brain barrier, which is our last line of defense against chemical. So we are poisoning ourselves with the plastic. Everybody in this room who's eating fish soon will have more than 50% chance to eat plastic with fish. And third is global warming, which is making, this is so depressing. And, and then we have, I never make it to the second date when they ask me what I do. Global warming, which is making the ocean warmer and more acidic, killing coral reefs and oyster beds and a bunch of animals and plants across the food chain. What's the solution? For overfishing is very easy. You stop fishing, the fish come back, and the World Bank produced a report last year showing that if the number of boats in the water was reduced by half, the remaining half would be catching the same amount of fish. So we know what we want to do. Protected areas, we already know what they can do. And there is now President Trump signed an executive order ordering to review 27 of the national monuments of the US, which are the highest level of protection in this country. And that includes 3 marine national monuments that industry has been lobbying for reopening to fishing, tuna and shark fishing and other species. And Secretary Zinke, Secretary of the Interior, made recommendations to to Trump, and 3 monuments were recommended to be reopened to fishing, and it's all in the White House. He has not made the decision yet, so we're just waiting. But there's been a lot of effort by NGOs in the United States to push back and ask the White House not to open these sacred places to exploitation. On the land, yeah, oil and uranium mining, and yeah.
I promised I wouldn't mention Scrooge again, so let's not get into Trump too much. Okay, over there. Yeah.
Thank you for this fascinating and important panel. I work on the Biophilic Cities project, and so my question to you is from the point of view of an urbanite. To what extent do you think people's experience of nature within their urban environment supports the work that you do, and if so, how?
Good question.
I think it's really important. I think that experiences in nature in your backyard are what lead you to look beyond your backyard. I think some of those earliest experiences, all the research shows that unstructured time to explore nature, to, as Dr. Wilson says in this video, handle other forms of life, even like squeeze a frog a little too hard, make you a student of nature. And so I think that the urban park building efforts that so many conservation groups are doing only support these larger these larger ecosystem scale projects.
Yeah, I'd just add how critical it is as our populations become more and more concentrated in cities. If we're going to make this leap in terms of hearts and minds of people to be able to connect to these large-scale conservation projects far away from the cities, we have to have urban parks be included within that 50% of the planet that's reserved. Yes.
Thank you. This question, I guess, is for Alison. So the triangle you described, or you presented to us, includes a lot of public land. And all the presentations talked mainly about opportunities to use public-private partnerships, but I think mainly focused on reserving private lands. And obviously in the United States, public lands become a big part of the conservation strategy. And I'm just curious, setting aside, I'll avoid comments about the current administration. Setting aside the challenges that we face now, what role do you see for working with partners on public lands to achieve those outcomes? Because to build the connectivity that's necessary to restore the integrity of those landscapes, it seems to me some sort of working relationship with public lands is going to be essential. And fortunately, it'll take some time, so this blip in the screen hopefully will pass in terms of the current administration. But what is the long-term strategy to work with partners in the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, and other landscapes to achieve those outcomes?
I think it's really the bedrock of our model. As I didn't go into great depth about what you were seeing on that map, but the area where we're working is primarily Bureau of Land Management lands. It's about there are about 2 million acres of BLM lands managed by the Department of Interior, and then the Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge is 1 million acres, and that's the second largest wildlife refuge in the lower 48. So that's the anchor, and that's where the opportunity comes to build American Prairie Reserve, is in buying these fragmented pieces of private land and then working toward as I said, working toward common wildlife and public access goals, working with the Department of Interior and those two agencies to manage that towards wildlife goals. So it's really the foundation of our model. And as we look, as you mentioned, further into the triangle, that there are, as you say, lots of national forest lands and other lands will be critical to making to that connectivity.
Other questions?
Yes, my name is Kurt Lindberg, and I'm interested in learning more about the intrinsic motivation that the 5 of you have found that has really led to the contributions you've been able to make. You know, it's well known, I think, in psychology and human development now that being able to contribute to something in life beyond yourself gives true meaning to life. And I'd like to hear more about the stories in your lives that have given you meaning and driven you.
Excellent question.
Well, I can start. Well, for me, as a Mozambican girl, of course, my life was not that easy and smoothly, but everything started at home, I would say, with my, father image really pushing. And the love for biology also starts very early, but when I went to undergrad, and I was just thinking only on biology, only on species, etc., and not the human side. But after that, I had an opportunity to have more experiences with the social side. And now I am more like, I don't want these two separated. I want them both together. And I would say, I'll just go to the main reason why I'm here today, because it's necessary to see these two together. And in a place like my country, Mozambique, the fact that I'm also a young girl also puts a lot on my shoulder, because I really want to bring light, for example, and I really want to show the other girls and even boys that, that past or that cycle can be broken and we can do something more. The love for wilderness areas or animals were always there, but a lot of things happened that kind of did not let that window open to see a lot of people, of young people near protected areas or even in Africa and Mozambique, when they think about conservation and biology and biodiversity, they not always associate with good things. They associate it with bad things, I would say conflict and history and many other things. So I am in a kind of role to also show them that now we're making it different and we want to make it different. So that's my bigger motivation, because every day I see girls and boys, younger or older than me, that look at me and don't really think that that would be possible for them. So that's my bigger motivation.
Over here?
Yes. Is it on? Oh, okay. Yeah, I was quite impressed by how many of you have struggled to put buffers around these wild areas that you're trying to protect, and how many of you have worked with local communities and so forth. But at the same time, I've been impressed by the fragility of the circumstances within which you work, where political changes of one kind or another could turn things around on you fairly quickly. I've been fretting about the environment ever since I read this book, Half Earth, and it's occurred to me it would be nice for the United States to make our park systems constitutional entities and not just legal entities federally. And I'm wondering, for the rest of you, what would be your most desired legal remedy that would give you some more protection for what it is you're trying to do to preserve the wild in the spirit of Half Earth, and protect Half Earth from the other half, that is us?
Anyone?
Okay, well, I'll jump in there. It's not even my area of expertise. Arguably the best protected public lands on Earth are the constitutionally protected Adirondack Park, the Forever Wild Clause in the state constitution of New York, which protects the Adirondacks and the Catskill Forest Reserves as forever wild lands. So having that sort of constitutional protection is a great idea. More public lands should be protected in that way. And now I'm going to pivot back to this question and say there are many ways, and I have been blessed in life to have had many opportunities to reinforce my innate biophilia. And I'm not going to tell a single story about that, but I will say that it has been an extraordinary pleasure and privilege in my life to work with Doug and Chris Tompkins, particularly initially when I was a grantee of Doug, one of his foundations, and then come to work for that same foundation that had been supporting that NGO that I ran. Doug Tompkins often talked about the value of meaningful work. that there is nothing that gives a person more pleasure in life than to have the opportunity to work with colleagues, to do something that was meaningful. And he used to talk, of course, about paying his rent for living on the planet, borrowing the idea from late David Brower. You know, at Esprit, he made all those millions from selling the idea that every 14-year-old in 1980s North America needed to have a T-shirt that said Esprit on it. And he got very, very wealthy from that, of selling and inculcating desire for a fashion item that then would be, you know, discarded. And he spent the last quarter century of his life deeply engaged, using all of his money, energy, power, influence, to do something that he thought would transcend and help, you know, essentially pay restitution for that economic life he had had as a business person. And that I always come back to this idea that every single, you know, project that we're talking about here is linked to philanthropy. It's private philanthropy engaging public institutions, including legal structures. But the juice here comes from private initiative and private dollars. And if you could, thinking back, okay, now I'm pivoting to your last question, I'm only 15 more seconds. If we could get to this vision, you know, 50 years out and we're looking back, I would say a whole lot of the reason we got there to this half-Earth vision. Hopefully it's not a dystopian future that a plague or pandemic has gotten us there, but that we solved some of the energy problems, the climate problems, and the spiritual problems of continuing to look at the Earth as a commodity of resources for us. And we got to that idea that we're a member of the community of life, and the specific tactics and tools we get to those protected areas are going to involve private philanthropy that's innovative, that's catalytic, and affects public institutions. Every single place on the map that was saved for nature was saved by people like us in this room who were engaged and wanted to do meaningful work.
I'm getting a little run out. We have a question from Twitter?
Okay. A question from Twitter from Andrew in the UK, and he asks, what is the role of zoos in supporting the objectives of Half Earth Day?
Oh, interesting. Role of zoos. Yeah.
I think that zoos should shift their mission completely to helping endangered species reproduce in captivity and being reintroduced in the field. I think that should be the main, or centers for helping like recovery. You know, a sea turtle caught on a beach in the Pacific that is injured can be taken to the National Aquarium and be healed there, and then return to the sea. But in this age of virtual reality and augmented reality that is here already, I don't think we need to have real animals to inspire city people. So I think that, yeah, zoos should help bring back species that are on the brink of extinction. That should be their main mission.
Yeah.
All right. Do we have time for one more question? Yes, over here.
Hi, Alison closed with that comment from Dr. Wilson about the union between children and nature. And considering the success that Pristine Seas has had of convincing world leaders that they need to be the hero of, for in this problem we're all talking about, and then also considering that in this Darwinian future 50 years from now, that children will be the ones in charge. What do each of you think is the most effective way to convince children now that they can be a hero, and how to start?
Take them to nature. That's it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's it.
Yeah. I think that's the common theme of we're getting at too is to how to not maintain contact but multiply the degree of contact we have with our fellow denizens of the planet. So thank you so much, panelists. It's been a wonderful afternoon, and thank you, Jonathan and Dr. Wilson and the audience. And go buy Wild Sky Burgers. Thank you, Dominique. It's really, really inspiring.
Sneakers torn in the hour when the homeless move cardboard blankets, and the new day is born. Folded in his backpack pocket, the question